Hello, and welcome to this ICA in Conversation webinar. We will be broadcasting the In Conversation webinars on the second and fourth Wednesdays of every month now. So whereas up until now it's only been on a monthly basis, we're moving this now to twice every month. And it's always going to be on a Wednesday, the second and the fourth, and it will always be at 1:30 in the afternoon for UK time. Obviously, for colleagues around the world, if you pay attention to what the time is in the UK, you can figure out the timings are locally. So that's the intention, and our format is always going to be the same. There will be a 20-minute conversation with a leading subject matter expert, very often hosted by myself or one of my colleagues within the ICA. And following 20 minutes, for those that might need to leave, then of course that will be a good time. But we will then follow it with 10 minutes responding to your questions, whatever observations, challenges, or questions that you might bring. We're going to focus on those in particular for the last 10 minutes. So if you're able to stick around for that, then that would be good. Of course, if you've got any questions, please bring them to the chat function or share them via LinkedIn, and we'll do our very best to get to them. Today our focus is on fraud. This, of course, is a significant and growing threat, not just here in the UK, but across the world. And in order to talk about this, I'm delighted to be joined by Gayon Hart. Gayon has very significant experience in this area, but Gayon, thank you for joining me now. And I'm going to suggest that perhaps you could very briefly highlight your experience and the reason that you're here today.
Yes, this always makes me feel old. I'm a former senior Crown advocate, prosecuted the most complex and high-profile frauds. I was seconded to the Attorney General's office to design and bringing the current counter-fraud architecture across the UK. Trained all 42 police forces on the Fraud Act when it came out, and then went from gamekeeper to poacher and implemented a counter-fraud control environment for one of the largest global banks, and it was a global control environment. And then when working for Amazon, advised the NCSC and the Home Office and Ofcom on the online safety bill and giving advice on e-commerce and online advertising fraud. And currently I sort of advise companies on how to protect themselves from latest developments in fraud and technology, etc.
You and I have the Fraud Act in common. I was actually on the national working group that was developing the early thinking around the Fraud Act. Of course, you've been on the flip side of this in introducing it to police forces. So yeah, I wasn't aware of that. It's good to hear. And Gayon, thank you again for joining us. We're going to be talking about fraud. And I think a good place to start is just to reflect for a moment on the scale of it. I know this is something that you've paid very close attention to. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows the headline figures, $4.5 trillion worth of global fraud, and we all know that that's only what could be estimated, and unreported fraud is huge. I sort of have a tendency, I like the more sort of extreme statistics. So I've been doing some work with the Asia Pacific banks and organizations on counter fraud. 4% of all transactions across Asia Pacific in 2023 were ID fraud attempts or attacks. And across EU, that's about 1.5%. Deep fakes in 2003 increased by 1,530%. There was a 200% surge in voice scams. One of my favorite ones is in the US. December 2022 is a milestone in fraud. Over 45% of all email traffic in the US in December 2022 were spam messages. In the UK, we know there's been this year a 104% increase on 2022 figures in fraud. and a new novel vector in the fact that over 77% of all frauds now start on social media.
And as we reflect on those numbers, we can also reflect on the advances in technology that we know are being used by criminals. So, for instance, the use of artificial intelligence to tailor fraud attacks to individuals. So, rather than taking a very blanket approach with, for instance, identity type fraud, the artificial intelligence enables the attack to be very focused on the individual, their circumstances, and so on. That's just one example. So these alarming numbers that you raise now perhaps preface a continued growth, both in the volume, but also in the nature of the threat that we face. It's growing in sophistication and challenge. Is that a fair
Oh,
reflection?
certainly. I mean, just imagine you're a bank manager, and this is a true case, a recent case. Speaks on the video chat to a client who he sees, recognizes, discusses. That client says, "Well, I want to do a 25 million pound dollar transaction." It was agreed, decided as a bank manager to get other people on board. So opened up the video conference to see other people in the organization, agreed, transferred the money to discover it was a major deep fake. $25 million gone. You're talking about 32 years of technology to create the capability of two-factor authentication. You know, the little text message you get. It took 9 months for fraudsters to defraud that from O2 Telefonica and to use reverse and proxy frauds in order to access the or intercept, shall we say, the second authentication before it came to you. It is and those figures, 1,530% increases in sort of that type of technology. So it is a technological war. And there are good technologies, the NCSE, and I've worked with them, as I say, on online advertising fraud specifically. So there's good counter technologies, but it's a big step. What we think is safe: video identification, two-factor authentication. If it's a complex fraud, it can be done. I mean, I like the recent deepfake, which was the Russian delegation to the EU Commission. Had a nice chat for over half an hour. Obviously, they're not allowed to appear in person. And then at the end of it, the Russian delegates turned around and faded out the fake autonomotor that they were using and appeared as real agents saying, "You've just been conned."
Extraordinary, isn't it? So the biometric measures that we've become dependent upon for verification of ID and similar, now they are being undermined by these new technologies. And so there's almost an arms race in the way that you describe between criminals and law enforcement, but not just law enforcement, also regulated entities in responding to that challenge and ensuring that we have confidence around who we're talking to, for instance. That's a really good example.
Yeah, I mean, if global counter fraud, but also compliance is $215 billion spent a year by companies, primarily banks. I think that's at about 187 billion in financial institutions on protecting their customers and their own finances from fraud, money laundering, bribery, and corruption. It's become a staggering environment. You and I were talking about new requirements. There's a new failure to prevent sexual harassment offence that has come in the UK. There's ESG requirements that are proliferating across the globe. And there's now failure to prevent fraud, which is all going to start sitting in your compliance function.
So
Yay.
that's a lovely segue, I think, to thinking for a little bit about how governments are responding to the fraud threat. We can perhaps talk separately about the bank's responsibilities and other regulated entities, but how are governments responding to this? What steps are they taking?
Well, predominantly globally, they're starting to put the responsibility on the front line to organizations. In China, for example, they passed the anti-telecom and online fraud law. That's an unofficial English translation, I should say. I won't butcher my Chinese. But essentially, it puts the requirement on financial institution, telecom operators, internet service providers to set up internal systems for preventing and controlling fraud risks. In Singapore, they've created a new law about SingPass credentials. In other words, if you let your bank accounts be used, an example was a 17-year-old who handed over his internet banking credentials and ATM card to an unknown person for the sake of $400 to support his education. This is now an offence in Singapore. You've got in the UK as well the new failure to prevent fraud offence. You've got the new corporate liability offence. But essentially, it's making compliance officers the front line of defence.
So this is an interesting point, and we can talk about how this plays out in a moment. But before we do, I think it's worth pausing to reflect for a moment that, well, I remember when I was a detective, not far from here, actually, in the City of London, um, 35, 40 years ago, at a time when I'm guessing
Doesn't
you may,
look like that. It's only
well,
10 years, of course.
thank you. I hope this is recorded, but
Yeah.
so that's very kind of you, Cam. But I think it was, and it may have been at a sort of time when you were acting as a Crown prosecutor, so you will have seen this yourself, or maybe a little bit before then. But and the reason I mention this is because at that time, dealing with fraud and other forms of financial crime was quite simply seen as the responsibility of the police. It was straightforward. You didn't really need to think about it too much. And it didn't even occur to us that actually we could change the responsibility and the onus and accountability around this. But successive governments have, over decades across the world, driven by, for instance, the Financial Action Task Force, by the United Nations, by G7, by other similar changes, what they've effectively done is move accountability and responsibility for dealing with fraud straight forward from law enforcement to the private sector. And in particular, not entirely, but in particular to banks. So that's in money laundering, corruption, we can see that, terrorist financing, we can see that. Of course, sanctions compliance, arguably it is by its very nature. And now we're seeing fraud coming into this space as well. Is that a fair characterization? Or is that what you're seeing?
Absolutely, and I think we're looking at it's good timing on this on Monday this week. APP fraud reimbursement, the mandatory reimbursement scheme came in, that faster payment providers and chaps have got to reimburse any faster payments up to £85,000. And they can spread that between the receiver, etc. But it's up to 80,000, and they have to reimburse it. We're seeing the failure to prevent fraud offence, which the government are still humming and hawing over the guidance, but is likely to be implemented over the next, probably from, well, before, I'm told in government circles it's going to be before this year, and therefore we'll have a 6-month implementation. And that makes it an offence for companies to externally fraud somebody. Up to now, all internal companies have controlled internal fraud risk because it comes off their bottom line. They
Of course.
don't want fraud against them, but they've never had a requirement really to protect the external world and to have procedures, policies, systems, processes, risk assessments, training, hence ICA. It's got a good place there. But all of this is required now, and it's about 6 months likely implementation. They might expand it to a year. It's one of the things that I, as one of the advisors, asked for, to give companies more time to prepare. But it means that they have got to protect externally. So if you defraud others, and it creates some interesting nuances. Companies are looking at this as a selling side. If we sell something, we defraud someone about the quality or greenwashing. But there's also multiple areas of your organization that you may not have thought about, like procurement side. And I do an example. Shall I continue? I mean, I do an
Please,
example
yeah, please
in
do.
a very simple scenario. If you're going out, and it's deliberately simple, if you have a procurement team and you're buying 1,000 chairs for the office, let's say, and you turn around and you say in a negotiation, oh, I've got 2 cheaper quotes. If you come down and reduce your price, I'd much rather go for you, lower your price. And the company lowers his price in response. Now, it's a negotiation tactic. If you lied or you misrepresented the truth, you didn't have two cheaper quotes, they were the same quote, or you didn't have two of them, etc. And tell me who hasn't done that in insurance company bargaining every year when you're trying to insure your car. But the reality is, for a company now, or it will be soon, if you do that, you've got to start looking at that is a criminal offense for the company that could lead to incredible liability um, across a whole board. So, is that a material misstatement? You should ask yourself. Yes, because you knew there weren't two quotes. Was
Yeah.
it made directly or indirectly to any system or person? Yes, you told the person. Was it about a fact, legal position, or state of mind? Yes, these are the questions the prosecution will be looking at and the regulators. Did others take action as a result? Yes, they reduced their price. Was the statement untrue? Yes, you had no quotes, for example. Did the person who made it know it was untrue or misrepresentation? Yes. And was there a benefit to the company? Well, they got a cheaper price. But it doesn't even have to be a benefit, it could be a loss to another company. So, did the other company lose something? Yes, they had to lower their price. And therefore, if any elements of those offence, even if you're abroad and you're dealing with a UK customer or your company elsewhere, you could, if you're large enough and some other factors, be now criminally liable for a multi-million dollar fine.
And this, of course, is analogous to what we saw introduced through in the UK through the Bribery Act of 2010, and elsewhere in France, of course, the SAPIN provisions. And we know that many countries around the world are introducing this type of response to fraud, well, to corruption, certainly. And we're now seeing the same methodology being used. And my understanding is the guidance that's going to accompany this is likely to be quite similar to the Bribery Act guidance.
Yeah, we're hoping. I mean, as someone who's looked at it, we're hoping that it's going to be slightly better and easier and more practical and
Okay.
pragmatic. Because when I was implementing the Bribery Act in this bank, it was quite difficult to assess where it would go. But yeah, we've got a lot more basics now, and it's actually more expansive. What companies don't realise, particularly those abroad, is that it's a wider scope than the UK Bribery Act failure to prevent, because it doesn't require a company to be an issuer. Now, it's narrower because it only applies to large companies. So, for example, you've got to have one of two, more than 250 employees, more than 36 million take turnover, more than 18 million on a bank account. But more importantly, you don't have to be present in the UK. Unlike the UK Bribery Act, you had to be present or have an office or presence. You have to be in the UK. Here, it could be a Saudi Arabian or a French or a German company. If there's an element within the UK that I need for the prosecution, so for example, it's a UK citizen in the UK, or it goes through the UK bank account, or it's involved with a UK communication system, you yourself, that company would be liable wherever they're based, and their associated persons, those who act for or on their behalf. And
And in fairness, though, that we know that for the Bribery Act, the associated persons provision is also in place, isn't it? So it only needs for a company that could be operating in Saudi Arabia to have an associated person or entity within the UK for it to fall within our provisions. But yes, I can see that it is even more comprehensive around fraud. I'm going to invite, if I may, any colleagues joining us around the world to perhaps raise any questions that they may have. And I'd be really pleased to share those and perhaps respond with Gaon. But in the meantime, Gaon, can I just clarify the two things that you've talked about? We've touched on government response to fraud. We've talked prior to that about the sheer scale of fraud and the escalating threat that we face. The two areas that you've set out, the first is around reimbursement. And this is for payment providers, of course, an obligation for them to reimburse when their customers are victim to fraud. The second, which we spent a little bit longer talking about, is the failure to prevent fraud offence. So these are two separate areas. Can we just go back for a moment to the first of those two? Um, it, if I try and step away from this for a moment and try to be objective, it is incredibly surprising that the payment provider is somehow on the hook for a decision that could be made by a customer, potentially even against their advice. Can you have I understood that correctly? And just to be really clear for those that are joining us, what is the extent of this liability?
Yeah, I mean, it is it's something that the financial institutions have argued against for a long time, and they're actually saying, it's only for app fraud, for authorized push payment fraud. It actually creates an interesting definition. One of the things I would highly recommend people do if they want to know more is look at the PSR guidance, Payment Service Regulators guidance on it, because they produced what is for government a really sort of clear and concise piece of guidance. So it's for app fraud where a person uses a fraudulent or dishonest act or a course of conduct to manipulate, deceive, or persuade a customer into transferring funds. And it's got to be where the recipient is not the intended payer or the payment is not for the purpose intended. Um, it is limited to 85,000, but that I think, in my experience, is about. I think the overwhelming majority of app frauds are £1,000 or less. So and the PSR themselves say it'd be 99.8% by volume and 90% by value. It covers faster payments, so anything done by a faster payment, and it's reflected in the chaps as well, and it excludes credit unions, municipal banks, etc. But it basically means that you, as a customer, even if you're advised not to do something, unless you have been what they call grossly negligent in a way or on your part, in other words, you've really ignored everything and you've been I think one of the phrases I heard was stupid customers. But I think what they mean there is gross negligence, and you've had little regard to warnings or interventions by the bank. Apart from those scenarios, you're going to get reimbursed. And that's a great thing for customers. The receiving bank or the paying bank can claim 50% from the receiving bank, but it is a difficult concept for banks to swallow, and they're talking about having to reimburse because you're talking about 450 million pounds worth of app fraud generally in the UK a year. So, is there going to have to be interest on your standard accounts? Are they going to start to recoup that money through customers in another way?
And of course, an interesting thing that might fall out of this is, does it encourage fraudsters or discourage them? I suppose we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. But I expect that fraudsters will be looking very closely at how the banks respond to this. And typically, the banks take an approach which is threshold driven, and they may well look to, for instance, come in beneath certain thresholds to trigger certain responses and so on. Or is that oversimplifying the position?
Well, I mean, it's one of the arguments. When I work for Amazon, one of the things that Amazon does is they have an A to Z reimbursement model. So whatever reason you have, your product isn't good or you've paid for something you didn't get it, you could get reimbursed. So it's the equivalent. And there was always an argument that internally that it may lead to more fraud because there is a certain level of fraud. So I think there will be a certain level of participation. I think, and there is an exemption if you as a customer participate in the fraud, but I think there is a risk. I personally don't think it's that big a risk in real terms. I think it won't add much to what is already. I mean, $4.5 trillion worth of fraud in across the globe already. I don't think this will make the meter move a lot. And I think what you'll find is, remember, other countries are also doing it. So it's being considered
Yeah.
in multiple other countries. And it's going to be a standardization, I think, because fraud is the single largest vector anywhere and everywhere. And I think that is one of the things that we should go. By the way, I noticed some questions that were coming
Yeah,
in.
please do. I was going to
Go
come to that. My thanks to Umang Sodoni, and you ask about creating a one-time password for card payments. So this is a development of our sort of historic and existing security measures to actually create something unique for individual transactions. And Umang, you're asking, will this help to reduce fraud? And of course, with that, the requirement to reimburse customers.
Well, we've had one-time passwords. We've had, two-factor authentication for a while now.
Yeah,
Fraud's gone up every year.
yeah.
So the answer to your last one is I don't think it will reduce the reimbursement. And fraudsters, I mean, look, I'm not saying it's not a good policy, but fraudsters are already through their reverse and forward proxy attacks. In other words, the servers that sit in front of your organization to protect your organization, they're attacking those servers. So they're already attacking it. It helps reduce fraud. I don't think there's any doubt that it's a good element. Well, I'm always nervous about new technology because I was around during the change to pins rather than the signature, and removing that requirement for someone just to look. And I know no one really looked and nobody was an expert, but it added an extra element of risk to the fraudster. Going to a PIN number has enhanced and increased fraud dramatically. I should probably say this because government brought it in as a fraud measurement, but it was a simplified payment measurement. It didn't actually help with fraud. And anyone who has used their partner's bank card or has used their child's bank card legally, I should point out, but because they know the pin, will know how easy it is. If you want to look on deepfakes in the dark web, for £100 you can obtain 100 pin numbers, mother maiden names, and all access. And there's fraudsters offering a money back guarantee if you don't get at least £3,000 from each account. So PIN numbers have been one project that didn't work, I don't think. I think two-factor authentication is going some way, but it's already starting to go down.
And you've touched on there another enabler for criminality, which is the dark web. I think Digital Shadows published a report that estimated about 15 billion unique user credentials are available to be purchased on the dark web. It's hard to process those sorts of numbers. We've
Yeah.
got one or two. Sorry, go on.
I was gonna say, yeah, when I worked for the Secret Intelligence, work with them, you could access, you can see everybody's. There's almost nobody who hasn't got a lot of their details on the dark web. There was a question about socks I noticed.
Yes,
I
yes.
think the failure to prevent fraud is exactly mandating control environment, because it basically says if you do, it's a strict liability offence, which means whether you intended for a staff member or designed or deliberate, or whether even knew that your staff member was defrauding somebody else, the company is liable. And if you look at the bribery and corruption levels of fines, fraud could be up to that level. Think about Airbus 1 billion euros worth of fine, etc. So I think that is a mandatory. And what is missing most in the fight against fraud? What is missing most, I think, is the single most difficult thing. If you ask any fraud expert, they'll say collaboration, greater collaboration between companies, telecoms. If you knew all the data on an individual about their telecommunications, their phone bills, their bank accounts, their tax receipts, the HMRC information, if you had all of this, you would be able to reduce fraud by about 70-80%. But the problem, understandable problem, is that if I said to you, Tim, would you like me to be able to look at your bank statements, your tax details? You're going to say, no, not for a minute.
Yeah.
So I think the clearest challenge at the moment, of course, budgets will help, resources, police forces need to adapt, the etc. And companies need to put in more controls, which is what this is designed to do. But I do think changing the mindset from the GDPR protectionist view of data to a more understanding that certain groups of people need to access data and can use that to help protect society is probably one of the biggest mindsets and hardest things to do, because I'm not sure I would want anybody to look at all my data,
Right.
but maybe we have to expand beyond that. But yes, corporate
So,
controls, absolutely.
I mean, just on that, we're coming up to time, but just on that, having investigated fraud for large parts of my career and spoken to countless victims, if you were to ask me, where is the weak link, where is the greatest vulnerability, and I would say human beings, and whether that's driven by greed. You've used the word stupid. I think you're absolutely right. I don't think there's
It wasn't my word. I
legislation.
wouldn't
No,
use that
no,
word. I
but
was saying it was used in government terms.
and look, I don't think it would necessarily be a bad word to use for some of the victims that I've certainly interviewed. I come away, my parents have fallen victim to fraud twice. They've had to phone me up and ask me to bail them out. There's been some really interesting comments that have featured for whilst we've been speaking within the LinkedIn feed. So my thanks to all those that have added their thoughts, their observations. We don't have time, I'm afraid, to get to all of them, but I'd encourage all of us to read through those observations, and I hope get a better and stronger picture around the issues that we're talking about. However, I'm going to bring this towards a close, Gaon. Before I do that, though, can I ask, are there any one or two burning issues that you'd like to share in terms of advice or key considerations or things that are top of your mind before we close?
So one of the things I talk to clients about, corporate clients about, is firstly, this new law, it is going to make a difference. And if you're not in the UK, it will be expanding across. Every government is looking at this to see if it works. And they did with the Bribery Act, 23 new companies.
Yeah.
So what you need to do is start with a risk assessment. Start that now. Where are your risks for external fraud, i.e., your teams for defrauding others? Where are the risks in your organization, your associated persons, those who act for or on your behalf? Secondly, the first question prosecutors are going to do is say to your staff, do you know about external fraud? Training, and I know I'm walking straight into your ambit, Tim. So here's a little promo, but the ICA are doing training on for and training, get the staff aware, make sure that people are ready in procurement, in marketing, in the new unusual high risk groups. Greenwashing is a big area that everybody's looking at. The FCA, you've got Competition Markets Authority, you've got the ASA, the Advertising Standards Agency, all looking to get to manage that risk. So risk assessment first, start that now. The law's coming in, there's not likely to be anything that doesn't require risk assessment, and it takes a long period of time to really assess your risks. Show that you're ahead of the game. If someone in your firm or organization defrauds someone else, misrepresentation, etc., that's going to be the basics. Did you do a risk assessment? Otherwise, the level of your fine is just going to be enormous. Get it down, get reasonable procedures. Risk assessment and training are the two key start processes I would suggest.
Leon, thank you. And before we finish, can I say that we will be going again for our next In Conversation webinar, which takes place at 1:30 on the last Wednesday of October. My colleague, James Rickett, Global Lead for Anti-Money Laundering and Sanctions Compliance, is going to be talking to an SME around the challenges we face in meeting sanctions requirements at the moment. But for the moment, Gayon, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been fascinating. I wish we had longer to explore these issues. And for whoever it is, for whoever you are around the world who have joined us today, thank you for your interest and for your time. We hope this has been useful, and I look forward to meeting you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.